Hey, this video is going to contain a lot of flashing screen effects throughout, so if you're photosensitive, you may want to skip this video. The year is 1994. Nintendo and Rareware had blown the minds of gamers everywhere with the release of Donkey Kong Country, and were preparing to launch its sequel as well as the Super Nintendo port of their seminal arcade fighting game, Killer Instinct, the following year. Oh, wait a minute, that's the wrong game. Having been there myself, I can tell you Donkey Kong Country was a big deal when it came out. There really wasn't anything else quite like it on the console market at the time. Heck, my first Super Nintendo came bundled with the game. Nintendo's biggest direct competitor, Sega, were looking for their own answer to DKC, something that used a similar visual style of pre-rendered backgrounds and 3D models shrunken down into 2D sprites. And in 1995, Sega answered with Vectorman, developed by California-based studio Blue Sky Software. Yeah, so an American-made game on a Japanese-made system. You don't see too many of those these days, right? Sega themselves were in a bit of an interesting position in 1995. 3, or I guess technically 4, mainline Sonic games had came and went by 1995, and by then, consumer interest in the Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you want to get European about it, had been on the decline, even after the release of the Sega CD and 32X add-ons. Hell, the Genesis' successor, the Sega Saturn, had already been out for almost a whole year, but was facing some trouble finding an audience, competing against both the Super Nintendo as well as the much-hyped Sony PlayStation that was on the horizon. Tale as old as time at this point, you already know it. So Sega needed another hit on their most famous system to stay afloat, so they were betting on Vectorman. And it was, indeed, a critical and commercial success, spawning a sequel in 1996, the appropriately titled Vectorman 2! So Sega had a hit series on their hands here, but for reasons I'll delve into later, the Vectorman series ultimately began and ended on the Sega Genesis drive. So, you know what that means. Put on your raincoats and prepare your bouquet of roses, because we're about to pay our respects to the Vectorman series today in the franchise graveyard. Now that I've gone over the series in a general sense, let's take a look at each game in greater detail. The year is 2049, and the planet Earth has been polluted so badly that the human race has evacuated the planet to live on colonies in outer space. All the while, mechanical robots known as Orbots are sent to clean up the planet to make it safe for humans to someday return. Yep, even almost 30 years ago, we had media making statements about protecting the environment. Well, then again, I guess this was after Captain Planet. Anyway, the cleanup effort is run by a powerful Orbot named Raster, and in error, a salvaged nuclear bomb is attached to his master control circuits, twisting him into the genocidal dictator now known as Warhead, who plans to attack the humans when they return to Earth. Enter our hero, Vectorman, who was off-planet dumping toxic sludge into the sun while all of this was going on. Not being under Warhead's mind control like the rest of the Orbots, he discovers Warhead's plans and sets out to stop him. Vectorman 1 really puts a good foot forward in terms of its presentation. Like I alluded to earlier, as a direct answer to Donkey Kong Country's graphical style, the Vectorman games utilize a style of 3D models shrunken down and compressed into 2D sprites. While I don't find the graphics to be quite as detailed as the ones in Donkey Kong Country, this was older hardware than the Super Nintendo after all, I will admit that it is genuinely very impressive that they were able to do these kinds of graphics at all on the Genesis. Not bad at all for a console that came out in 1988. Vectorman himself is comprised of individually animated sprites, all working in tandem with each other to make up his body, And when you lose a life, they'll all fall apart and interact with the environment individually from each other. I'll be getting more into that particular topic later. He's also affected by certain light sources, which is a very nice touch. Vectorman's primary gameplay style is a side-scrolling run-and-gun platformer. Like many others of its day, your primary goal is to reach the end of a level while blasting away at your enemies.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
Which are robots under Warhead's mind control. Along the way, you'll pick up different ammo types that have different firing styles. They have a finite amount of uses, but you won't know that until you're reaching the end of it, when you start hearing this loud, continuous beeping noise that only ends when you run out of that type of weapon. By the time you start hearing it, though, you'll only have a few shots left, so I personally didn't find it all that annoying. Vectorman also has jet boots, which allows him to make a second jump in midair, but it can also be used to attack enemies, which is very useful. Running and gunning won't be the only thing you'll be doing in this game, though. Throughout certain levels, you'll find power-ups that'll allow you to transform into different modes, such as a drill to, well, drill down through certain breakable floors, a dune buggy to speed through portions of levels and ram down walls, a fish to swim underwater faster, and an atomic bomb which acts as a screen nuke. Some of these transformations are permanent for specific levels, such as level 2 here where you're transformed into a train and have to fight this guy over a suspended train track. So for the first 4 levels of the game, it's a reasonably comfortable ride. Aside from the fact that you have next to no invincibility frames after you get hit. Video games have these things called invincibility frames. You've probably heard them referred to as iframes, and they exist for a reason. So that if you get hit by an enemy or a stage hazard, you have a couple of seconds to get your bearings, correct yourself, and try whatever you were doing again. You don't really have that here in Vectorman 1. Don't be surprised if you end up getting comboed to death by enemies. It will happen. If you're close enough to a group of enemies, you won't keep taking damage, but you will get slinged around a lot. And I think the most annoying enemy in the game that will be the source of a lot of your agony are these respawning bugs. They're not even robot bugs, they're just regular-ass beetles. They will occasionally drop health restoring pickups, so that's good, but you won't have time to farm them because each level also has a time limit. You can find items to add 2 extra minutes to the clock, but I think I only ever found like 2 during my whole playthrough. One thing you'll really need to count on in this game are the multiplier pickups. Whatever health items, points gained by picking up these photon collectibles, and 1-ups are multiplied by the amount shown. There are multipliers of 2, 3, 5, and 10 times multipliers, so it's possible that you can gain as many as 10 extra lives from a single 1-up. Speaking of score, the other way to get extra lives is by achieving enough points. It changes depending on what difficulty mode you're on, but grabbing these photons will increase your score. But also, at the end of levels, you're scored on completing the level, how much time you had left, how many photons you collected, and how many TVs you destroyed. Get enough points, and you get an extra life. That's all well and good, but I just wish that the game was a little bit more generous with the 1-ups. There are bonus levels you can enter that'll award you with tons of points for clearing them, which involves blowing up these satellite dishes and the shield generators protecting them. But I never found any of these in my playthrough. I actually didn't find out about them until much later. And trust me, even on the game's lowest difficulty setting, which the game lovingly refers to as lame, you're gonna need every extra life you can get your hands on, because once all of your lives are gone, it's game over. No continues, no passwords, no save points, nothing. If you lose all of your lives, no matter how far you are in the game, you gotta start the whole game all over again from level 1.
Fuck this shit! I came in this fucking room and everything went fucking bad. Fuck this shit, man. Fuck.
This is what many games were like back then, and I'm pretty sure I know the reason why. This was during the video game rental era. For those of you watching this video that are under the age of 20, we used to have these things called rental stores, brick-and-mortar businesses that allowed you to rent out games and movies for a certain amount of time for a much lower price than buying them outright.
Sweet, we're closing early.
In the realm of the video game, this was seen by consumers as a cost-effective way of playing a game and even finishing it for a much, much lower price than it would be to just buy the game. One of the biggest open secrets around this time was that game publishers hated the rental model as it cut massively into their potential profits. So to combat this, developers simply made their games as hard as possible so that players wouldn't be able to beat them in a single weekend, and would be more encouraged to just buy the games for themselves. I'm wondering if that ever actually worked and translated into sales, or if more people just got frustrated with the games and just never bothered to touch them again. Yeah, I can easily see that being the case for Vectorman 1 because, oh boy. As soon as level 5, this game gets brutal. Thank God both of these games are on Steam now with full save state functionality. Anyway, level 5, you'll be trucking along just fine until you come up across this big old bastard here. A literal progression wall, if you will. It will not move, it is impervious to shots from head-on, and trying to jump will just have him leap into the air to intercept you. It does have a weak spot on him somewhere, but I, for the life of me, could not figure out where it was. The only way I was able to get past him was to exploit the fact that shooting downward while in midair slows your descent, and running under him while he's still airborne. I can so easily see this guy right here being an early game wall for a lot of people. I actually watched a friend of mine play this on the Wii ages ago, and I remember that even he didn't know how to get past him either. I wonder if he ever got this far in his original Genesis copy. Another thing that I think makes this game a lot harder than it really should be is how close up the screen is. I don't know if it counts as being called screen crunch, but your field of view is pretty small. Whenever you change the direction, the screen will swing back over to the direction you're facing, and if you do it too fast, the camera loses its mind a little and starts swinging all around. So don't be surprised if you end up colliding with an enemy when this happens. Oh, and speaking of the camera, if an item or power-up shows up and you off-screen it, that item will despawn. And that can get really annoying when you're trying to grab photons to increase your score, or a health item, and they just disappear. Whenever the level geometry is askew, it can also affect your aiming, but thankfully the game doesn't do this too often. Oh, and this is fun. I only saw this when I went back through my footage, but whatever health you had at the end of a level carries over. So if you're down to your last hit point at the end of one level, that's all you get when you start the next. Just one more little flick to the nuts that this game loves to give you. There is an item to increase your maximum health, but I couldn't find any. The only reason I'm shown with 5 instead of the standard 4 here is because I dropped the difficulty down after I kept getting killed in level 1. God almighty, this game is hard. There will be bosses that show up at the ends of some of the regular levels, but among the game's 16 levels, you'll also get whole levels dedicated to just fighting a boss. I didn't actually know this until I looked it up in the instruction manual, but evidently, all of these fights are actually against Warhead himself. So that's pretty interesting that you aren't just battling his lackeys. The big guy himself will constantly show up and try to destroy you. With that in mind, the game's main antagonist serves as a constant looming threat. The levels themselves are pretty varied. You'll go from an aircraft landing station, to the ocean, to an Arctic cave system, a bamboo factory. There aren't very many repeating stages, so the level variety is fairly high, and they all look great. I struggled like hell in level 7. You're on this giant rolling mat in the form of what, according to the manual, is supposed to be a cricket, and you have these two giant hands that are trying to crush you. All the while, the level is scrolling, and falling too far behind will cause you to fall off and kill you instantly. It didn't occur to me until far longer than I would like to admit that this is actually a boss fight, and you're supposed to shoot the hands and destroy them, and that's what clears the level. I thought I was supposed to make it to the end, but I wasn't reaching any sort of ending section, and time kept running out. I also didn't know it until after I had already beaten the game, but the manual just straight up tells you how to beat him. Yeah, can you tell I didn't grow up with this game? I was a Nintendo kid growing up, what can I say? Yeah, the manual just tells you how to beat Warhead in all of his appearances, save for the one at the very end. But I didn't actually have too much trouble getting through the rest of the game. Right up until the end of level 14, where you have 3 mini-bosses that you have to fight. The first one's not too bad, but the second one likes to charge at you and get right up under you. It's actually here I discovered your second jump actually gives you a tiny bit of extra horizontal distance, so I was able to prevail after about 5 straight minutes of dying. And by this point, I had run totally out of lives, so I was having to use and abuse that quick load function. The version I played was the Steam version off of the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Collections library, which has a built-in save state feature, and let me tell you, thank God this version has built-in save states, because there is no way in hell I would have beaten this game on original hardware. Yeah, I know this might make me look like a phony, but I don't give a shit. Honestly, to sum up my own personal experience with the first Vectorman, or at least the one I captured for this video, it can be a good time when it isn't absolutely depriving you of health pickups, extra lives, or chances to correct yourself after taking a hit from enemies. This is classic old school challenge, and if you're not prepared for it, it will not hesitate to hand you your ass and then send you all the way back to level 1 to try it all over again. You've got balls of steel if you were able to beat this game on original hardware without cheat codes. In fact, if you use cheat codes at any time during your playthrough, this is the ending screen that you'll get. I actually got fed up with dying to the final boss over and over again, so I did resort to using one, but seeing this ending screen was what convinced me to try it again legit. Or as legit as you can get with save states. I gotta admit, even with the game being relentlessly difficult, I can still easily see myself coming back to this just for fun. I mean, at this point I've already beaten it once, I don't have anything to prove now. But with that, we now move this retrospective over to the game that I actually did own as a kid. The 1996 follow-up, Vectorman 2. Okay, so a little bit of my own personal background with this game before we begin. Like I said, I actually did own Vectorman 2 as a kid, but the version I owned was part of the Sega Smash Pack 2 compilation on PC. Back on my old Gateway 2000 computer with Windows 98 and a 2GB hard drive. This is actually how I played almost all of these games for the first time. I remember Shining Force being really good, and Kid Chameleon being literally impossible. I still have that disc around here somewhere. So anyway, we open the game with Vectorman chilling in outer space over the planet. We aren't just given a few still images with text this time, we have an actual animated cutscene, which I don't doubt is a Sega Genesis rarity. This must have been mind-blowing for Genesis owners back in the day, particularly Vectorman jamming out right here.
I got bitches all on my dick and every day.
Sadly, our little jam session is short-lived, as Vectorman's ship is blasted out of orbit by a rocket from an unknown assailant, and he's forced to make an emergency crash landing back down to the planet, which I assume is meant to be Earth? Oh, okay, yeah, that is supposed to be Earth. Again, instruction manuals damn near essential for games from this era. Not complaining though, just an observation. I also noticed that despite picking up right where the first game leaves off, they gave Vectorman a much deeper voice than the original. Maybe he gave himself a voice modifier in that short time while he was on his ship. I don't know. Anyway, the very first level has you slowly landing down towards Earth, all the while blasting away at the game's new central enemies, mutant insects. And thankfully not these annoying bastards from the first game that love to pop up out of nowhere and hit you.
You dick!
So there's a bit of a difference in theme from the first game. That game being incredibly mechanical and science fiction themed with lots of levels taking place in and around man-made structures. Here, a majority of the game's environments are more natural, taking place outdoors in a variety of areas like a swamp, an erupting volcano, and a cave system. And also, instead of destroying TVs for goodies, this time you'll be destroying these organic-looking cocoon things. Gameplay is largely the same as the original. You have your standard run and gun levels with a few different gameplay styles to mix things up. I'll get more into those later. You even have multiple different kinds of special stages this time around where you can rack up points, extra lives, and increases to your maximum health.
If only we could fly!
I gotta say, I had a much easier time finding extra lives and max health upgrades this time around as opposed to Vectorman 1. I will admit that for this video, for the sake of making progress and capturing footage, I did play the game on lame difficulty again. What can I say, these old school games are no joke. If you do lose all your lives, not only do you get a game over screen, the dang end credits start playing. I mean, what in the world is that about? Normal mode is still pretty dang hard. There's a reason why one of the screenshots on the Steam page is a dead Vectorman on level 2. The person in charge of grabbing screenshots for the Steam page clearly had a rough time playing this. And let me tell ya, the easy mode in Vectorman 2 actually felt like an easy mode. It wasn't like with the first game where, even on easy mode, I was constantly on my last hit point on my last life, desperately trying to find a health restore and not having enough time to farm for them due to the rather strict time limits. Now, Vectorman 2 still doesn't really give you iframes, and the checkpoints can still be a bit unforgiving, but this time around, I was having no problem snagging extra lives and actually keeping them. And this is thanks in no small part to the increased amount of bonus levels that Vectorman 2 has over the original. I was snagging bonuses left, right, and center, and completing them outright awards you with even more points towards an extra life. Heck, I wasn't even relying on save states nearly as much this time around. The main point I'm trying to make here is that for a first playthrough anyway, definitely play it on easy. Unless you like having your balls crushed. Though that isn't to say that the challenge in this mode is completely missing. Like I alluded to earlier, Vectorman 2 still doesn't have much in the way of iframes, and there's still no continues, passwords, or a save function. But I found that a lot of the challenge this time around is from figuring out how to reach the end, and not so much by getting carpet bombed by enemies and having no recovery time. As early as level 3, you'll be faced with this challenge. You're climbing up on these tree branches, and figuring out where to jump is the main challenge. It can get pretty frustrating missing a jump and falling all the way to the bottom and having to start over, but luckily, the game is pretty generous with its time limits, so it's not exactly the end of the world. This is actually the level I had trouble clearing as a kid. Despite that though, these swamp levels are some of my favorites in the game. Just something about wooded areas at night is super appealing to me, personally, and the music that plays during these levels is super chill and fits nicely. I like how even these flying bug enemies will change Vectorman different colors if they hit him. Even his lives meter changes colors. It's a nice touch. You still get to transform, and this time enemies will even drop transformation items. These ones are based off of the insect enemy that you've taken out, such as this rhino beetle, which allows you to run real fast and charge into enemies. You also get massive fists from these tick enemies, and the one that I'm not super crazy about, the scorpion stinger. And not gonna lie, I didn't really like this one. I had a habit of missing enemies with it, and it kind of felt like when I tried to button mash, the animation restarts before it actually hits anything. It's kind of hard to explain. And of course, there are levels where you're transformed for the entire level up until the end. The bonus stages have you transformed as a ship, and some levels will have you playing as a tank or on roller skates. These levels only repeat a couple of times, but I did notice that those levels are super close to each other. The roller skate levels are separated by another type of level, but the tank levels are just right next to each other. They probably could have been combined into one level, to be honest. Speaking of levels, they're a bit shorter than the ones in Vectorman 1, but there's a few more of them this time around. 22 as opposed to Vectorman 1's 16. The game doesn't go as weird with its levels like Vectorman 1 did. No fighting bosses on a rolling mat like in the first game. The levels and boss fights are much more straightforward this time around, and adhere more to the core platforming and run and gun. Perhaps to the game's detriment, depending on how you liked the variety in the first game. Like, if you liked how creative and out there the boss fights could get in the first game, for example, you might be a bit disappointed to see that all of the boss fights in Vectorman 2 just take place in a standard side-scrolling box. Overall, I gotta say Vectorman 2, for me anyway, was a much less frustrating experience than the first game. Still not a cakewalk, but by no means a fast track to an ulcer like the first game was. This section on Vectorman 2 is a bit shorter because, for the most part, it's more of the same, but if you dig the first game, you'll more than likely dig this too. Which I guess begs the question, should you give these games a go? Even with how tough they can be, of course you should play them. Even if you aren't able to find physical Sega cartridges or the 6th gen console re-releases both games have had since, you can get them on Steam for just 99 cents each. There's probably also some mobile versions out there too. Honestly, with how affordable these games are, even with how balls-bustingly hard they can get, it's almost impossible for me not to recommend them. Since the release of Vectorman 2 in 1996, there was, surprisingly, more than one attempt to bring the Green Robot back for a three-peat. In fact, there were plans for a third Vectorman title before the second one was even out on store shelves. The developers over at Blue Sky created a design document for this third title, which was internally dubbed under an alternate title, Vectorman Ultra, and would have released for the Sega Saturn, the successor to the Genesis. Keep in mind, the Saturn was already out by the time the first Vectorman made it out onto store shelves. But before even that, Sega of America apparently entered into a deal with a company called Ideal Entertainment, with plans to produce a TV show, a theatrical film, and a line of merchandise based on the series. The film would have been in collaboration with visual effects studio Tribal Tech, who did the special effects for the movie Independence Day. If this article's anything to go by anyway, links below for that. Well, I don't think you need me to tell you that none of those things materialized. Anyway, Blue Sky were in the conceptualizing stages for Vectorman 3. Many concept sketches were made, like the ones you see here. But by the time that they were ready to pitch this version of Vectorman 3 to Sega, their contract with them was mysteriously terminated. No official reason for this termination, or the cancellation of this project, have been made public by the making of this video. It may or may not have something to do with the sluggish performance of the Sega Saturn on the market. I mean, do you know anybody who owned one? Because I sure as hell didn't. Fast forward to the year 2000, and Sega had a brand new console on the market, the Dreamcast. A few of the key players at Blue Sky Software had left the company following a purchase by game publisher Titus Interactive, and went on to create a new studio called V-Blank, who would eventually go on to make games such as Shakedown Hawaii and Retro City Rampage. Oh, wait, not that V-Blank? Okay, well this is gonna get confusing. With their new studio founded and a newer, shinier engine raring to go, these developers approached Sega, who then presented them with a list of IPs that they were interested in reviving for the Dreamcast. And as luck would have it, one of those IPs was Vectorman. So with that, the team began work on a playable prototype for what was effectively their second time pitching Vectorman 3, now dubbed Vectorman Neo. This new installment would have seen our spherical hero exploring a previously unexplored alien planet. As exciting as it sounded, when the team at V-Blank presented the demo to Sega, they declined, stating that at this point in time, Vectorman no longer had brand recognition. And because Sega owned the IP, you can probably already see where this is going. This project would ultimately get canceled as well. I personally was unaware of either of these attempts at a Vectorman 3, but I can tell you about the one I was aware of, and that was the Vectorman reboot first announced in 2003. It would have been a PS2 exclusive, and it would have been developed by Toronto-based studio Pseudo Interactive, the same devs behind the Xbox launch title car combat game, Cell Damage. This was around the time that Sega expressed interest in resurrecting some of their Genesis-era IPs, which I don't doubt was the plan that resulted in Gunstar Heroes getting a sequel on the Game Boy Advance in 2005. I think I first heard about this on an episode of X-Play, where they were at E3 or something, and they had a demo available. At the time, I was like, oh neat, they're making a new Vectorman game. And then sometime after that, I started seeing the V-Man's drastic new redesign be compared to another green, heavily armored, gun-toting hero. These were comparisons that this design simply couldn't escape. Not only did it look more like Halo, the gameplay was quite similar as well. This reboot would be mostly moving away from platforming and was now a full-blown third-person shooter. For the record though, it at the very least looked like a functional third-person shooter. One that I wouldn't have minded playing. It even would have had destructible environments. This grittier, darker look for Vectorman wasn't always the plan though, as one of the earlier prototype builds, referred to internally as Vectorman 3.14, had him more closely resemble his original look. It's super early development footage, but the game looked something like this. Apparently, the destructible environments would have made an appearance in this version, so it must have been decided early on to include that as a gameplay feature. Development at this time was still pretty malleable, and an official look for the game hadn't been nailed all the way down. It wasn't until E3 2003 when the trailer released that the game's more gritty, darker tone was decided upon. Now, this is a whole rabbit hole apparently, but the ultimate takeaway from it is that, judging by the fact that the game never got released, that Sega didn't have a whole lot of faith in the project and pulled the plug on it shortly after the E3 reveal. And with that, the entire Vectorman series just kind of died. I mean, we are in the franchise graveyard after all. But you know, not all hope may be lost for a potential revival of the series. In December 2023, during the Game Awards, Sega made the absolutely unexpected announcement that they were resurrecting many of their long-dormant old-school franchises and making brand new games out of them. Like, for real, who the hell expected Sega to ever bring back Jet Set Radio or Crazy Taxi? Oh, and you see that? That big ol' "and more" at the end there? This implies that there are more remakes or whatever of other Sega properties in the works that they're keeping a lid on. At the time I'm making this video, these are the only ones that they've revealed, but who knows what could get announced. I'm just glad they're finally paying attention to something other than Sonic for a change. If you're watching this after May 2024, they've already announced, released, or canceled stuff, considering where the industry's been heading recently. And by then, I'm sure we'll all know whether or not they've revived our favorite spherical hero. Spherical! But hey, fingers crossed. With the environmental-friendly message of the first game, and how apocalyptic things are now, what with the climate crisis and all that, they could totally do a new Vectorman, especially if they follow the plot of the first game, like a remake or something. Honestly, who even knows at this point? It would be cool, though. It'll date this video pretty hard if they do end up making a new Vectorman game, but hey, that's just how it goes. And you know what? If they do end up making a new one, I'll be more than happy to take a look at it for the channel. You know what I'll do? I'll even make it a day one purchase. At this point in time, though, I'm just gonna have to wait and see.